I'd like to welcome everybody to our webinar today that's being presented by QualiTest and Zeenyx. We're just going to wait another minute or two for people that are still joining the conference, so just hang with us and we'll start momentarily. Hello everybody, this is Gary Heon. I'm with QualiTest. I'll be hosting and presenting the webinar today. We're going to talk a little bit about DevOps and some of the challenges that face DevOps, especially from a QA point of view. And we're also going to talk about some of the solutions that we have. I do ask that throughout the presentation, if you have questions, please ask them. Please go into the questions box on your screen and type all your questions, and we'll get to the end of the presentation. We'll go through and answer all those questions. Also, if you find this webinar very valuable and you want to either look at it again or share it with some of your colleagues, the presentation will be available on the QualiTest website in a couple of days. So we are recording it, and it'll be available to everybody. So let's start with a little intro. Like I said, I'm Gary Heon. I'm the business manager for QualiTest New Jersey. I also act as a senior test specialist. I started my career, 27, 28 years ago. I originally started at AT&T Bell Laboratories where, back in the late 80s, I was doing, what we consider normal for today, but I was doing keyword development, and we were actually doing automated script generation. So very early in my career, technology and driving technology and change into organization was very fundamental for me. So I spent the next many years of my career both in the trenches and in very senior QA management roles, helping companies to just implement more efficient QA processes, helping companies to implement Agile. And now here at QualiTest, as the business manager, I get to work with a host of different companies, and one of the things that we're really focused on is helping companies implement DevOps, because we're seeing DevOps is the next trend in the methodology of the way we're delivering software. Joining us today is Brian Lesueur. Even though I only met Brian a couple of years ago, I've actually known about his work for a very long time. So for me, it's an honor to actually work with him on this webinar. And let me introduce Brian and let him tell everybody a little bit about what he does and his background.
Thank you, Gary. Yeah, like Gary, I've been in the QA business for really all of my working life. I'm the former CEO for, I'm the CEO for Zeenyx Software, and we're the creators of Essential Test, which you're going to be learning about in this presentation. In the 90s, I headed up development for Segway Software, where we started a testing tool called Silk Test that some of you might be familiar with. In between those two roles, what I did was I formed a consulting company called Star Quality, and it was made up of some of the former Segway employees who are also part of Zeenyx Software. And what's interesting about that is, as we like to say, we got to eat our own dog food, which means that we were actually using the tool that we created with real organizations like yours. And so that experience virtually wrote the requirement for Essential Test, which I'm going to be showing you later in the presentation.
Okay, so moving forward, what we're going to do, we're going to do a little bit more introduction to talk about QualiTest and Zeenyx a little bit, so you know who they are. And then following up on that, we're going to talk a little bit at a high level, what DevOps is and what it's not. Some of the challenges, we've seen organizations face within DevOps. We're going to talk a little bit about resources and skill sets, especially within the QA organization. Then we're going to have Brian talk about the tools, and this is where we're going to see, how Essential Test is one of the solutions that's available for DevOps and QA. And then we're going to talk a little bit about metrics. And after we complete that, we'll move forward and we'll take any questions that may arise from the people listening to the webinar. So let me tell you a little bit about QualiTest. So for people that don't know, QualiTest is the second largest software testing company in the world. So software testing, QA, business assurance is all that QualiTest focuses on. And because of our approach to quality, Gartner has actually recognized us, in their Magic Quadrant for testing service companies, and we're the only one in that quadrant currently. Our approach to our customers is not from a staffing resource point of view. Our approach is to become a partner, a software testing partner of our clients. And what we deliver are solutions, and we tend to do them in a managed service, which really works together. We have skin in the game with our clients. We set SLAs, so we truly form a partnership with them, and we work towards a very common goal.
And I'll tell you a little bit about Zeenyx Software. As I mentioned in my intro, we're the creators of Essential Test, which is an award-winning testing solution for Windows, Web, .NET, Java, Power Builder, Terminal, and PDF. We're committed to reducing the cost of software testing by making testers more productive, which, as you'll see throughout this presentation, is really critical to agile, continuous delivery environment that we're about to discuss.
So, very briefly what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is DevOps and what does it mean, and really where did it come from. So if you look back over the last 15 years, for some it may be a little bit of a shorter time, might be 5 years, but what Agile has done to the software industry, right? So it was about collaboration and moving very quickly. So DevOps was actually born from Agile development and the need to keep up with the software velocity. So when we look at the entire development team, not just the developers writing code and QA testing, but also on the front end, the business analysts, and on what I consider the back end, the operations team, DevOps pulls all those people together. So with combined understanding of this value of collaboration between organizations, DevOps plays into that role. Where this became very, very important for those of you that are working in a SaaS environment where you have to quickly deliver code to your clients and they all get that code at the same time, this is where we're seeing the largest growth in DevOps methodology, because the companies in the business want to get software delivered to their clients as quickly as possible. So you have to take in the entire pipeline from business analysts to operations. And naturally, as the name suggests, it's a combination of software, QA, and operations disciplines. So DevOps, as the team started working together, they saw there was this interdependence between the team. The operations team really wasn't separate from the QA team, or operations wasn't separate from the development team. They were all working together for a single goal, and that was to get product into market as quickly as possible. So, I want to talk a little bit about what DevOps is not, right? And one of the things that we've seen through the last couple of years of actually implementing DevOps with our customers is this resistance to change. And if you look at why there's this resistance to change, it's, the operations guy may feel, well, geez, I now define infrastructure as code. Developers are going to take over my job. So DevOps is not about development taking over the operations team. It's not just about a change in culture on how people approach their work. It's not just tools. It's really a combination of all of that, right? It's a change in culture, it's a change in tools, it's a change in collaboration, and it's really a change in how the teams, work together. So, again, as we were implementing DevOps with our customers, we started seeing a couple of challenges, right? So the first challenge we saw was really the alignment of all the organizations, the development organization, the QA organization, the operations team. And in the past, if you all go all the way back to waterfall, people were working in silos, right? Then Agile brought the QA team and development team together. But in some organizations, you still saw where maybe development drove the whole process, right? And QA was just, well, you're just QA guys, you're just testing it. And then, the same with the operations team is they worked in a silo, and they would start building environments, possibly at the last minute. Schedules got delayed because environments weren't ready, or it just took too long to bring environments up because there was a lot of manual testing. So the alignment across all these organizations is very important to get everybody working towards the same goal. We had one customer who it was driven by the CIO. So people didn't have a choice, they had to get in line and do it. But we've had other organizations where the teams believed in the DevOps methodology, and they moved forward together to actually embrace it and make it happen. The second thing that the challenges we see is new skills. People need to learn new skills. And one of the things that's very important to us is the domain knowledge that the current team has in the product is paramount. It's number one. It's the thing you want to keep. So what you want to do is you want to teach the people that are in those teams about the DevOps tools, right? So for a QA person, it may be learning some new automation. For an operations person, it's learning new tools like Terraform or Puppet to be able to do their work. The other thing we see, and we see this in Agile too, but DevOps is a little bit different, and I'll explain that, is frequent code changes that need to be tested quickly. So typically what we've seen happen in an Agile world is, well, you know what, we'll test that stuff in the next sprint. And I'm sure everybody has heard that from one of their QA people or a manager somewhere. We'll just test it in the next sprint. In DevOps, it's about getting a test deployed and tested within that same sprint. So you need to be able to structure your test cases and your automation in a way that everything is tested within sprint. And when you're doing that with many frequent changes coming in, the automation suites, they have to be resilient to application changes. And this is something Brian's going to touch on when he starts talking about essential tests. The tools that we're going to need to use in the DevOps world are going to need to be able to handle frequent changes without going in and either re-architecting or re-scripting an entire scenario or an entire regression suite. Having the ability to automate in sprint. So I talked a little bit about that, previously, but automation in sprint, we have customers that say, well, when development's done, I want to know within 6 hours if the code is good. I want the full regression to run. The only way that happens is to automate in sprint. So that's extremely important. But the other piece that sometimes gets missed in DevOps are the non-automatable tests or the non-functional tests. Things like exploratory testing or UX type testing or usability testing, UAT. Those types of things kind of get lost, and we need to figure out a way to bring that stuff back into the cycle so we continue to provide the highest quality code as possible. And one of the things that we've seen, across the board is the need to maintain that developer to QA ratio. Once you have a ratio that works, you need to keep that set so you have that consistent delivery across sprints and across projects. So, how do we address some of these things? So here's where we've had a lot of success, right? We really were, sometimes, and again, I don't know everybody's agile environment, just, what I've seen is sometimes user stories aren't clearly defined or not available, at the beginning of the sprint. With DevOps, in order for everybody to meet their goals, they have to be clearly defined before the sprint open meeting. So we draw that line in the sand, and we absolutely have to make it happen. The other thing we do is mock-ups, right? Things like mock-ups of the HTML stuff. That stuff kind of went away in a lot of organizations with Agile. We're bringing that back in DevOps, and the reason why we're bringing it back is so while the developers writing their code, QA can be writing their test scripts and starting their automation against those mock-ups. And that's also something that Brian's going to show us with Essential Test, how we actually start creating that automation before the code's complete. So that's extremely powerful. And also, we need to make sure that when development completes their UI integration, the DOM elements are immediately available to QA to complete the test cases and actually start doing actually start debugging and running their automation scripts. Also, more on the cultural side, I think, is, testers needing to work very, very closely with development. Something, as simple as when an XPath or an identifier, object is available, don't wait to the next Scrum call to tell the QA team that it's ready. Make it happen immediately. Again, if you're working in, a 2-week sprint cycle, or in some cases what we've seen, we have customers that are working with a 1-week sprint cycle, you lose a day, you lost 20% of your development, your time to actually react to that. So it's very, very important that the teams work very, very closely together. Another example is the page object identifiers, or XPaths, are implemented so they're very well defined and unique. And this will avoid unnecessary rework, when a new feature is added to a subsequent build. And then, finally, I'm sure a lot of people are already working in continuous integration naturally with DevOps. We continue that trend. So we need to make sure that the appropriate automation is plugged into the continuous integration pipeline. I'm a firm believer, test early, test often, and you reduce the risk of the overall project. And that's something that we need to embrace, within the DevOps world. So let's talk a little bit about resources, right? Because, people are saying, oh, my goodness, I need to learn new tools. Am I going to have a job? I don't know these tools. So, as I said earlier, first, foremost, you need to maintain that good developer to QA ratio. At QualiTest, we have a new term that we're rolling out, and that's QualiTester. So what we're doing is all our testers, every QA engineer is a well-rounded, what we consider a well-rounded engineer. And what that means is they can analyze requirements, they can execute test cases manually, but they can also automate their test cases. And one of the reasons why we do this is we found there's this big inefficiency, especially in these very, very short sprints, where you might have an analyst that writes a test case, he throws it over the wall, kind of like in the old days when developers used to throw code over the wall to QA. But the manual guy will write the test case, he'll throw it over the wall to the automator. The automator really doesn't know the product very well, perhaps, or there's an issue within the test case that the manual guy overlooked, and you start the back and forth of communication to try and figure out what's wrong. So we found by having one person that does everything, we end up with a much more efficient process, and we actually end up with better tests that are ready to run, within the cycle. And we're finding, as we're building these skill sets, our QualiTesters actually become SDETs, right? But they're an SDETs that still perform manual testing when needed. So it's a nice all-round way of building your teams to succeed in the DevOps world. Also within this, like I've been saying earlier, the QA engineers are well versed within the technology, the tools, and the process, right? So they understand what it means to do continuous integration and continuous delivery. They know the fundamentals of Agile, right? Because DevOps, at the base is really Agile, but they also know how to use the tools that bring DevOps together. So things like Bamboo and Jenkins, a lot of times Jenkins is doing the build, Jenkins is also doing the deploy, and it's also firing off the automated script. So Jenkins is one of the more popular tools for controlling all this. So our guys know how to use it. They know how to use Git and TFS, and they understand automation frameworks, and they also understand the technologies around cloud. So what we're finding is a lot of these companies that are doing DevOps, they're moving their test environments to the cloud. Even if they host their own production environments, the test environments are in the cloud, so they need to understand AWS and how to use the tools of, if they're using Amazon, they need to know how to integrate with all those tools and integrate the test framework with the tools to be able to support cloud deployments. And most important, and this is something I drive with my entire team, is the need to keep up on the latest trending technologies, especially if you're working in the DevOps world, around DevOps. And again, for me, what Brian's going to show in Essential Test is kind of that new technology of how to work in an actual DevOps world. Kind of on the cultural side again, I call it cultural. The QA engineers really need to be empowered. So it's important for people in the management position to empower QA, right? To empower them to hold either developers, operations people, BAs, other QA members accountable. Because in order for the team to succeed, everybody needs to be held accountable. So we need the QA engineers really to feel empowered and really willing to step up and communicate and hold others accountable. We need to make sure the QA engineers are facilitating collaboration within the teams, right? Don't let, either that QA engineer go off in the corner and work by himself, or let the developer go off and say, don't bother me, I'm implementing code and you'll find it at the end when I'm done. We need to bring the collaboration together. It's extremely important. And as I said earlier when we were talking about the communication and working closely with dev, address the issues immediately. We have a number of customers that are working on one-week sprints, and when we don't address issues immediately, it comes back and it bites us, and it always causes a slip in the schedule. So the timelines are very tight, so it's important to make sure that everybody's on their game and we're addressing issues right away. So with that little bit of background, what I want to do is I want Brian, I invited him to this because I use this tool, I see how it plays into our DevOps world, and I think it's one of the leading edge solutions when it comes to automations within DevOps. So Brian, I'm gonna hand it off to you now, and show us some really cool stuff.
I will do that. Thank you, Gary. Gary talked about a few things that are really important in terms of automated testing tools. And one thing that we've learned so far is that there's frequent code and component changes. And what that means is that tests are going to be executed frequently. And as Gary said, it's really important that we find the defects right away as soon as they're introduced. We don't want to find defects 3 sprints later, because we want to trace it back to the most recent changes. That's the most efficient way to be able to resolve problems. The other thing is that in order for tests to be able to be ready, to be on demand, they need to be resilient to application changes. And the tests then need to be built with tools and approaches that make it possible to not only build tests quickly, but to maintain them. And so that's what I'm going to show you in Essential Test. Now, Gary also talked about collaboration in DevOps. And so it's very important we recognize that teams of people are going to be working to modify all of the integrated test components. And so a test project's got to be able to be compiled and be ready to execute at all times. And so we've integrated Essential Test with version control. So you don't have to leave Essential Test in order to make changes to the automation. From within Essential Test, you can update your project so that you're sure before you begin making changes that you're using the current version of the project. You can check in and out. You can merge changes visually so you can see what others have done so that you can merge your changes in. You can look at a version history so that you can see and understand all the changes that have been made to the automation. We've also built Essential Test so that it's easy to integrate with build systems. Gary mentioned Jenkins, and that seems to be the most popular tool amongst our customers. And so Essential Test execution engine is accessible from the command line so that it can be called by any build system, not just Jenkins. The command line provides a mechanism so that you can actually check out the latest version of the test so that you're sure that when the build system is going to run, it's always going to be targeting the applications with the most current versions of the test. We've also allowed our report generator to be called from that command line so that at the conclusion of the test, reports can be generated as well. And then recognizing that not everybody on the team has got Essential Test on their desktop, we've also created a portal to make the test results available to anyone in the organization, and you access that from a web browser. So you might be at a meeting and you've got your tablet and you just want to check on how the execution of the automated test is going. You can just take a look at the portal and check on the progress of the automation. At the same time, managers who don't have Essential Test or team leads, they can generate all of the reports directly from their web browser. Now let's talk a little bit about this resilience to change that Gary talked about. The first thing I want to tell you about Essential Test is that we have something that we call app objects. Essential Test is an object-oriented test tool. And we've created app objects because we want a single point of change. And you're going to see that theme over and over again as I start to show you Essential Test. So if an object in an application is modified, only the definition of that object needs to be updated in Essential Test. It won't affect your tests at all. That's one of the ways that we reduce the effort when it comes to maintaining your tests. We've also implemented something else called step-based testing. In Essential Test, tests are built with reusable components, and we call them steps, but they're really like little building blocks that you use to build tests. What's significant about these steps is that it actually speeds up the test creation process, because once you create a step, you never have to create it again. It's a little block that you could then use over and over again. And so if the target application changes, and of course it's going to change in this DevOps environment that we're talking about, it's going to change frequently. All you need to do in Essential Test is change the step that was affected by that change. But then all the tests that implement that step, that might be 5 tests, 10 tests, 1,000 tests, those tests do not need to be changed. Only the step needs to be changed. So that's a significant improvement in the level of effort to maintaining your tests. I'm going to show you Essential Test very, very briefly, a 2-minute demonstration. But what I want to point out is that Essential Test was designed so that these domain experts that Gary talked about could execute tests. or it could build tests. So I'm going to start a very, very short demo for you. And you'll see that with Essential Test, we're building tests in a drag and drop, point and click environment. Now, on the right-hand side, you see a snapshot, and you're going to see me dragging and dropping from the snapshot. And what I'm doing is, this does not have a recorder built into it. This is not a traditional recorder. Instead, you're using the snapshot to create something that we call a step. And you'll notice the value there. I could put a value directly in there, but if I did that, then the step would have hard-coded values in it, and it wouldn't be able to be reused. So instead, I asked Essential Test to create a couple of parameters. Now there's nothing hard-coded in that step. Now look how easy it is to create a test in Essential Test. I've got those steps over on the left, and I just dragged them and dropped them into the test editor, and I've built a test. Now I could put the data directly into those two cells there, but I don't want to do that because I want to create a data-driven test. So instead, I'm going to ask Essential Test to build a table for me. So I'm just going to provide a table name and click the OK button, and Essential Test will create my table for me where I'm going to store my test data. I'm going to add a couple of rows. I'm just going to key in some data so that we have some examples to use here. So I'm very quickly putting in a couple of user IDs and passwords. Now I'm going to go to the test plan, and you see I've got a little test plan there, and I'm going to take that test we just developed and I'm going to drop it on the plan. You see the little green T there. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to associate each one of the requirements in the plan with one of the rows in my data table. So through point and click, I was able to create a reusable step, I was able to create a test, and then I was able to integrate that test with my test plan. Again, all through point and click, so that I don't need any specialized skills in order to be able to do that. As Gary said, we are always learning skills, but Essential Test is a very easy product to learn to use. Now I want to take a slightly deeper dive into a couple of the aspects of the tool that you got to see very quickly. Here what we're seeing is the app objects part of our product. I've got a snapshot here. A snapshot is a smart image of the application. It's not just a picture of the application. We have the full hierarchy of the application, all the objects and all their attributes built into this snapshot. Now I've highlighted one object here, and you can see it's called first name, and it's lighting up the first name in the snapshot. And if we look quickly at the definition, we'll see that it's a web text field. It has the name first name, and it has a path. Now we're using an attribute in order to locate that object, and you can see here that there are a number of paths that could be used. The element ID, something that is to the right of a particular label. So this is how we're able to insulate your tests from potential changes in the application. So if an object changes, you can come here to the app objects, change the definition, but then all the tests that use that particular object will automatically be updated. I also want to take a closer look at a step. This is a step that's a little more involved than the one that you saw in the brief video. Here you see the snapshot again on the right, and you can see that I've dragged and dropped a number of actions. We call each of these an action. And each of these actions is actually setting a value to a field. And you can see the parameters up here as well. Now, the environment is not so limited that all you can do is drag and drop sets, as you've seen here. You can actually drag and drop your verification points. You can even do more than that. Let's say you're someone who's never written an if statement before, but you know you need a conditional statement. You can come over here to the Actions Explorer, and you can grab a statement like the if statement and just simply drag it and drop. The same thing goes with maybe you want to connect to an ODBC database or something like that. You can drag any of these actions and drop them over on your step, and we're automatically going to generate that action for you. And remember, these steps are reusable. So here we're taking a little bit of a closer look at an actual test, and you can see the steps here on the left. These steps are simply dragged and dropped into the editor. And what's significant about that is that you notice that there's no details about the step in the test editor itself. That's because those are encapsulated inside of those steps. So that again, if the target application changes, you'll go to the step and make a change to the step. That step may be used 5 times, 10 times, 100 times. It doesn't matter because you change the step and the test is automatically updated. So again, that's another way that we're able to reduce the amount of maintenance so that you can keep those tests always ready, always on demand in this DevOps environment. I'm going to pass it back over to Gary now to talk about metrics.
Great. Thanks, Brian.
Sure.
So now I want to talk about a little bit about metrics. And, one of the things that I've seen in the DevOps world where QA starts to add more value to the overall process is definitely around the metrics. So as everybody knows, QA is really metrics driven, right? It's all about test case execution, number of defects found in the release, the trend of defects found in the release, code quality. So we're already very metrics driven. And one of the things that we've done at QualiTest is we created a dashboard that is now more DevOps centric. And what does that mean? It means the DevOps, the people who are program managers for DevOps, they really want to see what the program looks like, right? So they're interested in things like, the change volume, right? Just basically, how much code are we pumping out, or new features and user stories are we pushing out to our clients? And that's important to the business because that's where the business is naturally making the money, by driving innovation into the marketplace. The lead time, right? Now it's how long is it taking me to get that feature into the production environment? We have one customer that wants to break it down and just, be more QA focused around, how long is it taking us to get the testing done, right? I have one customer who says, I want to know in 6 hours. So you need to have all the testing done within 6 hours of development complete. So naturally, it's a lot of automation running in parallel, but they're measuring that, and they're measuring it down to a very, very small time factor. How are we doing as a QA development organization when it comes to, the change failure rates? How many bugs are we introducing into the system? They're measuring production defects, which pretty much gets measured now, but they're also measuring it in terms of, how many, require rollbacks, how many bugs require a hot fix, over time, how are we doing it? But they're also measuring how long it takes to recover from that error. So if you roll something into production and you need to roll things back, we're measuring that time and we're providing that information. And also things like deployment frequency, right? So if we're doing a lot of builds a day and we're doing continuous integration and continuous delivery, we want to know how busy is that operations team really in making sure things are getting deployed. And again, because DevOps is really time-driven, how long is it taking just to even deploy that new code? And again, I think a lot of people already measure, the percentage of deployment that have issues. But again, this is all built into one centralized dashboard. And when you look at that dashboard and you look at, hey, I had, a failure going into production, you can drill down then into the QA metrics to actually see what was going on, number of test cases executed, or, one thing that's very valuable, hey, we found 800 defects in this release. You can't find them all, but, we can sure try. So you can start providing more feedback and more value, to the teams in order to, continuously improve. So one of the things we've done, at QualiTest is develop that dashboard, and our dashboard integrates with many, many different systems, because that's the other thing that we see is operations may use one thing to measure, deployments and deployment time and things like that, and QA and Dev may use a different tool. So, a lot of stuff is done on the ops side through Jenkins, but QA is using Jira. We have customers with different organizations within different development organizations actually use different tools. So we have a customer that's using TFS, Jira, and Jenkins, and one organization is actually using Rally, which I don't understand why they're using Rally and Jira, but we integrate all those systems together to provide that single view and that DevOps view of what's actually happening, within development operations, and we're able to report that back to the C-level people, the CIOs want to see, but also back to the business to show the value that the organization is adding to the business itself. So that's the end of at least the formal part of our presentation. I put my email address is up here, Brian's email address is up here. Feel free to reach out to us at any time if questions come up, afterwards, after the demo's done. We're getting questions coming in from people, so this is great. So let me start answering some of these questions. So we have, one question is, what's the typical dev QA ratio, right? The magic question has always been the magic question, people like to ask. Is it 5-to-1? Is it 7-to-1? Is it, 1-to-1? So from a DevOps perspective, we don't see those ratios changing too much over what you would see in a normal agile type of methodology. I have some clients where we're running, 4 developers to 1 QA person or 3. But again, it depends on the product. We have, one client that does product. They have a migration tool that, basically has a near infinite number of inputs to it, or combinations of inputs. And we actually have a ratio of 3 QA to 1 developer, just because of the sheer amount of testing that needs to get done with every change. So I'd like to give you a number, but it really depends on the application, the type of code changes. But typically we're seeing 3-4 developers to 1 QA. So that question was actually asked twice. So we had 2 people ask that. Richard and George both asked that question. Another really, really good question. QA isn't part of the DevOps name. Does this cause confusion? And yeah, it's funny. It's not really as the name suggests. I think typically, no, it doesn't cause confusion, at least from our experience. We do find that QA is really considered part of the development organization, and really for DevOps, they really bundled that together as, okay, your development, we're operations, now let's bring those 2 teams that in like the agile world has never worked together, being dev and operations. Now in the DevOps world they do work together. So although it's not part of the name, we haven't seen that confusion, because QA typically works as part of development, in the past. Okay, another good question. The question is, to get a hold on DevOps, do we need to know the code written by the development team? So I think from a DevOps perspective, the amount of knowledge that you need to know about the code doesn't really change from any other type of automation work or QA work that's been done in the past, right? Naturally, we talked a lot about automation in the DevOps world. It's a key component of it. So if you're able to understand, working off the mockups, working off DOMs, and the HTML if you're doing a web page, the knowledge you had in the past, that type of knowledge is not really going to change in the DevOps world. We're just going to see more automation in the DevOps world, has been our experience. I hope that answered the question. If not, you can type back in and definitely ask more questions, around that. Things are showing up out of order here, so just give me a brief second because I don't want to miss them. Okay, Brian, this one's for you. Here's the question. Apart from web apps and websites, where else can essential tests be utilized?
Sure. So although I did demonstrate essential test using a web app, essential test can be used for testing a regular Windows application. It could be used to test .NET, whether it be WinForms or WPF, Java, terminals. So if you have an old AS400 application, we test that. Power Builder, PDF. So really a number of application types. And one thing I forgot to mention that someone I think might be interested in, Gary, you talked about wireframes.
Right.
And you know, no matter what the platform is, but you know, let's talk about web specifically. Sometimes on the web, the wireframes will be available before the application has been actually written, like Gary said. And with essential tests, you could actually take your snapshots against those wireframes, and you could build your automation without even having the applications there. That's significant because QA and development could then work in parallel. QA is not waiting for the application to be developed in order to start to develop those tests. So again, we want the test to be ready within Sprint. That's one way that we can do that. And so those snapshots that you saw, even though I was showing you web snapshots, we take those same types of snapshots against any of those application types that I mentioned. So you get the exact same type of snapshot on a Windows application or a Power Builder application as I showed you with a web application.
Okay, great. Brian, we have another one for you. So currently, does Essential Test integrate with Power BI? You know, I'm assuming they're talking about the Microsoft Business Analytics tools.
I am not familiar with those tools, so it looks like Richard Cleaver asked that question. I will look into that, and I will get back to Richard on that. I'm not familiar with that tool.
Okay, great. And let's give you the other one. How available is Essential Test to consultants to try, you know, for clients to try, and really, you know, to promote the tools? And, you know, what's the cost?
Sure. So, well, let's talk about availability. We do free trials, and your trials are fully supported. So if you go to the Essential Test website, the Zeenyx website, there's a number of places where you could either get information or you can watch a video. But there are also forms on the website where you can request a demonstration. We do hour-long demonstrations twice a week on Thursday and Friday. Sort of publicly, people sign up for, but we also do demonstrations pretty much every day on demand. But you can also find forms there so that if you want to take out a trial, the 30-day trials are completely free, and like I said, they're fully supported. That would be for consultants. That's for end-user organizations. So just contact us through the website, and we'd be happy to set up a trial for you.
Oh, geez, another one came in. Well, and let's just keep this on Essential Test right now since the questions are rolling in there. Does Essential Test include defect management with it?
Oh, that's a great question. And Gary, you mentioned Jira. So what we do is we like to integrate with other tools. You know, our strength is in building a testing solution, not necessarily in a defect tracking tool. And there's a lot of good defect tracking tools out there. But what we like to do is we like to build really meaningful integration. So, for example, from within Essential Test, let's say you ran some tests and you had some errors. What you can do right from within Essential Test is you can associate those errors with defects in your defect tracking system. And so from your results file in Essential Test, you could actually double-click on a little bug icon, and the bug will open so that you can read the details of the defect. But what's even more interesting is once you've built this association between errors and defects, if a developer goes into Jira and marks a defect as fixed, in Essential Test gets notified, and we actually tell you all of the tests that were associated with that bug fix. so that you don't have to go look for them. You can mark them based on the fact that the status of that defect has changed, or ready to test, or whatever you call that particular status in your environment. Those tests will be marked to execute so that you can either sign off the fix or you can reject it. Another thing that we do is that we give you a query that you can run against your results, and it'll find all of the errors that don't have defects associated with them. It either prompts you to associate that error with a particular defect, or it's prompting you to potentially open a defect. So even though we don't build defect tracking, we integrate very, very tightly with defect tracking. We think that's a better strategy, is to allow people to find the best tools that they can, and then we integrate with those tools.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, sometimes it's better to just work with the best in breed than trying to do everything. So you develop a great automation tool, work with the best in breed when it comes to defect tracking. So that's great. Another question, I guess this one's more for me. So what benefits do we see in moving the dev testing environments into the cloud? I think that the number one reason why our customers are doing it is really around cost. So, in our more mature DevOps implementations, literally when the developer fires off his Jenkins build, when the build completes, it goes, the ops code goes out to AWS, it powers up the environment, it fully configures the environment, it deploys the code, the automation kicks off and runs, so all the tests are run, and then the environment is destroyed. So you're only spending money on a very, very small amount of uptime in the cloud versus having to buy the hardware. But also where it comes in is as the drive comes to reduce that time to market, right, and get it down as quickly as possible, we're running a lot of things in parallel. So if you want to have 10 test environments up and running simultaneously, you can. You're only paying for your uptime, and then you destroy them and you bring them back down. There's also testing that goes on in environments where you need, I guess the point is, anytime you need multiple environments and you want to do it as cheaply as possible, we find that doing it in the cloud just seems to be the way to go, and that's the way our customers are moving. They're taking advantage of the pricing that they can get in the cloud. So I hope that answers your question. If not, definitely, let's clarify, and either you can send me another question through the webinar, or we can actually communicate after it's over as well. So it's really, the cloud is really driven around cost. Also had another really good question, which really isn't DevOps, it's more Agile, but it's very, very important, so I definitely want to cover it. And that's, how do we ensure that user stories are understood before the sprint? So I think this is something that I've seen in the past where there wasn't, a really good understanding amongst the team. And even though Agile is supposed to be collaborative, you find that DevOps, if you're not collaborative, you just fail. So there's a few things, right? One is, any managers on here have set goals for their people. We talk about SMART goals. Well, we talk about smart user stories too with our clients, and specific, measurable, assignable, realistic, and they're time related. So can you get those stories done within the sprint? All the stories have a very clear definition of done, right? So we know what it means to actually complete the story. The collaboration, right? So now we're working in a world, based on the mock-ups and using more advanced tools. QA and development are working simultaneously on the same exact user story. So you have that collaboration, you have them working together, which drives, just the understanding of the user story between two different groups. So that helps, bring things together. And one of the things that we also drive, which, may be different than other people, is at the end of the sprint when we do the demos, it's QA doing the demo. So that drives the QA engineer to make sure he really understands what that user story was supposed to deliver. So by having that level of understanding and really being put on the spot and held accountable by the business for having that understanding, they're working very, very close to the developer to make sure they're delivering exactly what the business wanted. So I hope that answers the question about the user stories. So the final question is around metrics, and how do we measure quality and track progress? Are there any metrics that can be adopted? So a lot of this depends on the organization, how the organization works. With DevOps and continuous integration, the things that we start to measure, because with the high level of automation and being able to run things in parallel, in a cloud type environment, we can do more testing every night. So one of the metrics that we track is what is our code coverage every night from build to build. So we're looking at code coverage, and looking at the code coverage, we're also looking at the number of defects we're finding in each and every release. And as we see that that number is going down, the number of defects we're finding is going down, naturally the number of defects and the severity, as we see that going down, we know we're getting closer. Another thing that we do is more centered around risk, right? Because risk always plays into it. And one of the things we track is the number of defects by severity that we're finding from build to build across many releases per module or per feature. One of the things that I found with one of our clients is they have about a 3% chance of introducing a defect across most of their application. The example I used before is the same customer. I used before where I said we had like one developer, 2 QA people. It was on the migration tool. We found through metrics that they had a 40% chance of introducing a bug into the code base with every change that they made. So by using these metrics and bringing them together, we're able to better predict where we are and where we are from a progress point of view. So Brian, that looks like the end of the questions. I don't see any more rolling in.
Yeah, it looks like we've got them all.
Okay. So everybody, I want to thank you very much for joining our webinar today. I hope you found it, helpful and insightful. Brian and I, Brian more on the tools, me more on the whole overall DevOps piece. Feel free, send me an email anytime, and we'll be more than happy to discuss any issues you may be facing, or ways that we can help you solve any kind of DevOps questions you may have. So again, thank you very much. I hope everybody has a wonderful day. Again, this webinar is recorded, so it'll be up on our website in a few days, so you can go to the QualiTest website and take a look at it, review it, and if more questions come up, please feel free to reach out to us.
Thank you, Gary.
Okay. So with that, I'm gonna close it down. I hope everybody has a great day, and thank you very much for attending.